the event, please let me know via chat and I contact you one-to-one in order to assist you to solve your problem. Please use the chat window to raise a question and keep your microphone on mute to avoid any kind of noises which could disturb the presentation of the session. Your questions will be addressed during and after the presentation. And now, without any further delay, I would like to hand over to your lovely presenter, Michelle. Michelle, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Janina. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our second session of customization and configuration. And I see a few people that were actually on one of our calls last night, so thank you for staying up late and getting back up early for those individuals. So today we are beginning our second session, and we are going to be looking at security hierarchy as well as looking at the process flow. So the process flow has changed a little bit with Dynamics 365. The functionality of it is actually really the same. It's just the designer that has changed. So if you've worked with the process flow in the past, it's going to be very familiar to you, other than just the look and feel of how you develop those. But before we dive into today's presentation, we are going to go through real quick and just review what we talked about on our last call. So on our last call, which was our first call, we basically went over just that high level of Dynamics 365. And then we talked about the security model. Basically what, how does the security model work? What are some of the things within it? Access, privilege, those type of items. And then we also briefly talked just about the creation and the configuration with security roles and how that's part of the security model. Then we talked a little bit about the users and the teams. You have users who are going to be individuals within the system that have user licenses, but then you can also generate teams, which basically is going to be a group of users. And we talked about the two different types of teams, which is an owner team or an access team when working with those items. And then we also talked very briefly about business units within the system. And then a little bit about the user management email configuration. It was really mainly focusing on the mailbox, because that's the piece that we need to just keep in mind when it comes to your scenarios that you're going to have. And then we also have the using teams to extend the functionality. So then we kind of went a little bit deeper into that. So you may see some scenarios that are going to be similar to questions about teams. So when people are trying to access the system or access specific records, if they don't have any specific items within the within their security to see specific items, can they go ahead and actually access it? And if not, how can you utilize teams? Another piece that's just an important reminder about our some of the pieces that go with security and teams and all of that when you're thinking about some scenarios that you may run into. And remember, my word scenario is just a code word for what you may see on a screen while you're doing multiple choice. Some scenarios that you may run into are going to be about like layering that security. So remember to review the fact of what happens, if you have different security roles that are layered on top of each other. Regardless if it's an individual with two different security roles on their own security profile, on their user profile, or if they're a member of a team and have additional security added on top of it through a team. So maybe they have a security role on their user account, one on the team account, and what happens when those basically layer on top of each other. So just a reminder that that's something you just want to make sure you refresh on as well, because you may see one or two or three scenarios that are going to be about some of that layering of security. And then we also have the configuration, configuring Dynamics 365. That was just, quickly going in and just talking about some of the functionalities, of the system administrator area and what some of those different areas are within the system. So before we jump into our session today, which is our second session, any questions about anything that you saw on our previous session the other day, which was Monday? Okay, perfect. We'll go ahead then and we'll start our second session. Just a reminder, at the end of the session, we'll do some interactive polls. So the handout that we gave you on Monday that had 10 questions on it, we'll go through that at the end of the session today. So please stay on the line so you can go through those items. All right, so again, today we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the hierarchical security system and how that works. And then we'll also talk about processes. Your processes are all of those items, workflows, dialogues, custom actions, and actually business process flows. And then we'll actually dive into the business process flows as well. We'll spend a good amount of time on the business process flows, just the point, because the point of them adding that new look and feel to it, you may see a few more scenarios about business process flow due to them enhancing this feature a little bit. So we'll make sure to talk about that. All right, so let's first talk about extending our security with the hierarchical security. And what we'll just talk about is what it is. We'll talk about the configuration of it and the difference between manager hierarchy and position hierarchy within the system. So, what really is the purpose of hierarchy security? It's really to take what is already existing in the security model and extend it a little bit more to get more granular into it. And what they mean by that is when people have very tight security within their Dynamics 365 system, if they have it very tight where you can only basically see your own accounts or edit your own accounts, and they have it locked down where a lot of people aren't going to be able to do much in the system with other people's items. They came to a problem where they had a difficult time when there was organization hierarchy where people reported to other people, and those managers not being able to see the records that they needed to see without having to go in and create business units in order to do so. And one of the best practices really when you're building your security profile or your security module is that you don't build your business units within your system depending on how your organization structure is set up. It's not usually done by position. It's done by your actual business organization if you have different subsidiaries and need to block data and pieces like that. So the best practice has always been not to build that business unit off of that structure. So back in 2015, I believe it was, is when this came out, and it gave us the ability to actually apply the ability to apply some additional security onto the system to open up records depending on hierarchy that you set up within the system. It's a great functionality because it's used with the current system. So even if I have a manager who's set up to only see their own records, what's nice about the hierarchy piece is that I can actually set up the hierarchical security, and it's going to allow those managers to see people, see the records of people underneath them when you do that. Good evening, welcome. So then we also have, talking about where you access this. So this is basically accessed through security, and then when you go into security, there's a hierarchy security area. Number one, you must enable it. Number two, you also can then, once it's been enabled, you can go in and actually set the depth of the hierarchy. It is suggested that you don't go too far in depth by putting too large of a level in there, because it can actually slow the system down a little, because the security has to go through and unblock, look through this hierarchy chart, go through each of the security individuals and start unblocking certain records for a certain individual. So it can actually take quite a bit of time. So best practice is, try to keep it as low as possible that is needed. And it also gives you the ability to say what entities, pretty much are not going to be included within this setup. So it gives you that capability as well. The other piece is talking about, having two different ways of setting it up. When you go in, you can set it up with manager hierarchy, which basically is using the user entity. So whenever we put people in the system, you can actually go ahead and place who their manager is within that system. So Dinesh, in your case, you could be in the system and we could go ahead and put Daniel as your manager, and that way when we turn it on for managerial, it's going to read that field and say, okay, Daniel can see your record since that's the case. And then the other one is using position. So this is a little different because you can actually go ahead and form the hierarchy that you would like to use and put people into the group. So instead of using the user record and just saying, using it automatically off of whoever their manager is, you have the ability to say, well, this person is a VP of sales, even though all these people don't report underneath him, we're going to have this be a position above all of these other items. So it actually allows you to go ahead and start building out some of those positions. You have a choice when using this to either do one or the other. So I can either choose manager hierarchy, or I would choose position hierarchy. So only one of those can actually be utilized within the system. So what we're looking at here is just a quick little diagram of what the manager hierarchy security looks like within the system. So what you see here is it's going to be based on direct reporting structure. So it's using that manager field out of the system entity like I had discussed. So basically what it is whoever the manager, whoever is marked as the manager, that manager has all of those individuals considered to be their direct reports. So within this case, we have our VP of sales. All those sales managers underneath him actually have the VP of sales marked on their user record as their manager. So in this case, what we're looking at is the VP of sales is going to have read access to all of those sales managers' records. He's also going to have the write access, append, and append to privileges on those. So this basically means if his own security was set up that he could only view and edit his own records, now he will be able to do that for all of those sales managers underneath him. And now we can also see that we have the second layer that's under the sales manager, which are the actual just sales people. So in this case, all of the sales managers have access to read, write, append to those salespeople. But once you get past the one level of a direct report and go from the VP of sales down to the sales people, so now you're 2 levels from sales to VP of sales. At this point in time, the VP of sales will have access to read those salespeople's records. He just won't have the ability to do the edit or the append or the append to. So only a direct manager is going to have the ability to read, write, append, and append to on those records. The functionality actually works the same when you are looking at the position hierarchy. But really the only difference is that it's going to actually be manually set up. So instead of using the field off the user records, we create a position called VP of Sales, and we put our users in the VP of Sales who we want to consider that to be. We would go ahead and create a position called sales managers, and we would put all of our individuals in there. Then we would go ahead and put our a sales position and put our individuals in there as well. So it's basically manually building it out. So within this case, you might have something like a CEO where you just put that one person in there, and then they'll have that access to go down. So it gives you the same, the exact same function, but it just uses the different architecture in the background to choose how it works. And again, it is going to be the same. With your VP of Sales, you have the read, the write, the append directly to the sales managers because they're one level down. It's a direct report. And then, of course, once you go 2 levels down for that VP of Sales, those salespeople, same thing. He's just going to have that read access. So that functionality is going to work just a little bit different on that. So as you see, we don't have a demo on this piece because that means it's not going to be something that's going to be very important for your scenarios. It's just something that is included within this module, but you may not need to know too much about it when it comes to any type of scenarios you might come across. Our second piece is going to be talking about the processes in Dynamics 365. But before we do that, any questions about the positional or managerial hierarchy security? Perfect. Our next item is talking a little bit about processes in the system. So we have a few different processes. We have our business process flows. We also have our workflows that are processes, dialogues, custom actions as well. And we're also going to examine how to create Dynamics 365 workflows as well. These are areas, some of these are areas that you will see in scenarios. So keep an ear out while I'm going through some of these pages. So first off, just a reminder of what processes are. So processes give us the ability to do automation within the system. It's really the easiest way of looking at it. And by utilizing the different types of processes, give us just different ways of achieving this automation. So the first one, and we'll go into this because we do a whole module on it, is the actual process flows. So just a reminder of what those are. They've been around for quite some time with the older versions of CRM, and the process flows are when you are in an entity and you see the bar that goes across the top of the entity that helps guide your users through a specific process. So it gives you the ability to actually automate the business process that your users are going to utilize. And of course, this can be spanned over multiple entities. So, one of the out-of-the-box examples of this is the lead process bar, where you begin it at the lead area, and then as soon as you qualify that lead, that process bar continues within the opportunity that gets created. So there's a connection, and it keeps moving through those entities, so it can span across multiple entities. The next one is talking a little bit about workflows. Workflows are going to be what you see most commonly used still to this day. And basically this is what gives us some of our automation that is going to, automatically create a task for a user when something happens in the system. It may go ahead and send out an email when somebody completes something. It may also go ahead and update fields on a record when something occurs. Workflows are still, one of the most commonly used processes that are in the Dynamics 365 system. You also have custom actions, and they're, from what I understand, we will not really see any scenarios going into custom actions. Not too much that you have to be familiar with on this one, but it's good to know the difference because you may see it as a what's called a distractor within a scenario. So what Microsoft likes to do on their exam is, they always go ahead when they ask the scenario and you have your answers, they always go ahead and throw in the false answers, and usually 2 of them are going to be things that you can, if it's a multiple choice item, it's something you can just completely throw away. 2 of them, it's not the answer. But then they'll always have 2 to 3 that are left over that are going to be very that could be the answer, and then you really have to kind of think about which out of those is the best of those answers. So you may see custom actions pop up as, maybe a distractor or something like that, but not as much when it comes to the physical items that go, some of the scenarios that come through. But the custom actions are basically a way that you can actually do some of this automation, but it's basically created through code. So things that you cannot do and accomplish through workflows are normally accomplished through custom actions, where individuals used to have to write plugins to do something and just have something fire on the back end of CRM. With the custom actions, it now just gives them that ability to still write that code, but put it into a process that people can actually use these custom actions and trigger them and fire them through the process area instead. The other thing that I'm not too sure why it is left off of this area where they talk about process flow, workflow, and custom actions. The next one is just dialogues, and dialogues have been around CRM since I can remember, and they basically allow you to walk through or step through a process where it can ask you a question, you answer it within the dialogue, and then it's going to go ahead and then pop up the next page and not really like the process flow. It's more of something that may be used, let's say, for customer service. If they are going to go ahead and take in a return, they can actually start a dialogue if somebody's doing a return, and it can say what the question is. Ask them if they have opened the box, and then you have yes or no. If you choose no, that they haven't opened the box, and it goes to the next page that says, okay, great, do they have the original invoice, and kind of prompt them through. So prompt and response type of messaging in that. So the other one is the business process flows, and we'll go into this, but again, just a reminder, those are just that guided it guides users through those processes. It can involve multiple records within the system, meaning it can go across multiple entities as well. It's set up where you have different stages, and within the different stages that you're trying to complete, you have different steps that you need to accomplish to complete that stage. Making the steps required, you can actually make some of the steps within those stages required, meaning I cannot move to the next stage until that's completed. So it does have the ability to kind of lock you down on those pieces. The workflows, as I said, it's basically your automated process. For some of you that work with macros, it's something that likes to be compared, that it's very similar to how macros work. They can be tied to an event, or they can be fired on demand. So in other words, they have to be triggered. So you can do an automated trigger, or you can do a something to have it triggered, excuse me, something to have it triggered manually. So even though you're manually doing it on demand, that's still a type of trigger. So there's always something that's going to trigger a workflow to go off. Dynamics 365 does support two type of workflows. The two different types of workflows that it's going to work with are going to be your background workflows is the first one, and that's going to run in the background, and that basically allows those users to continue to work in the application while it's running in the background. The other one is something that was developed a few years after the background workflow, which was the real-time workflow, and that one runs at the time when it gets triggered. So the users basically kind of get put into a holding pattern until that real-time workflow finishes its steps, and then once it finishes, they'll be able to continue working through the system. All right, so a little bit about the background workflows. I actually highlighted, the asynchronous piece of this because in the scenarios, sometimes they like to call something a background workflow, but sometimes you might see something that says, it runs asynchronously. I have a hard time saying it with the ly on the end. So I like to make sure that you guys are aware that they can be called either or if you see it in a scenario. So again, those background workflows, those are going to be events or user triggered that are automated process that will go ahead and execute some type of action. They run asynchronously, there we go, and does not prevent a user from continuing. Most commonly they're used, it's the most common used type of workflow that is used, and it also does support what is called a wait condition, which basically can go ahead and either put it to sleep for a certain amount of time, and then it wakes up, at the time that it's been designated to wake up, or it can be put into a wait status where it's waiting for, something to occur before it goes ahead and continues on. So you do have the ability to do those as well. So as well with these workflows, these are again, the background workflows are what are most commonly used. That an example is if you close an opportunity as one, maybe you need to send an email off to the sales manager if that opportunity was over a certain dollar amount. So then an email will go ahead and fire off. Another one is like a project I'm currently working on is what we do is, when an opportunity is closed as one, it automatically creates a record that's called a job record that gets tied to that opportunity. So it'll automatically create this brand new record, and then it creates a task to let a certain team know that they have to go in and fill out all of this job information. All of that is done by using a background workflow. So again, what's important is just remembering that you may see scenarios that are going to be called either a background or asynchronously, or asynchronous. All right, so the other one is a real-time workflow. Now that's it's the sister one, and basically that's a synchronous workflow that happens, and this one actually as well, the other one allows people to continue working. This one actually will block the users from moving forward until it's been completed. You can execute it under the caller or the person that owns the workflow. So you don't have this option right down here. Whoops, sorry, my piece right there wrote over it a little bit, but you have this option down here, how you execute. So I can execute it as the owner of the workflow, or I can execute it as the user who made the change to the record as well. So basically, whoever made that workflow fire would be the person that executes it as. There's a separate privilege on the security role to control activation as well. That's actually the same as the other one. You just, not important to know. But it's just the ability that not everybody can go ahead and run those. It may impact system performance when they run synchronously. So most of the time people do background workflows, and background workflows are still considered to be the recommended practice, and you don't use the synchronous unless there is a good reason, a good business reason for it. The majority of the time, I use real-time workflows if I'm trying to prevent a user from moving on, or something along that line. An example of that is, we had an individual that, unless their lead held specific values, not that they were just populated, but they had specific values in some of their fields, they cannot qualify that lead. So I used a real-time workflow to basically prevent them. So when they hit that qualify button, a real-time workflow would check it real quick to see if those values were proper, and if they weren't, it basically stopped the workflow and popped up with a little message that told them you cannot continue until you fix XYZ. Those are some of the examples I use for real-time workflows, as well as going in and actually filling values on the form as well at the time, at runtime. Sometimes people need to bring back values from another entity into the current entity they're on, and instead of using JavaScript, you can use real-time workflows to accomplish things like that, so that definitely helps as well. The next one is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, which is our dialogues. And again, the dialogues provide users with a wizard or a script. So the example that I was giving was, it's a wizard that would pop up. They would start the dialogue. It was a script asking them questions about the person's return, and depending on the answer, the response to the prompt, you could build that dialogue to go ahead and bring it to different pages. So depending on what the response was, can bring different areas. This is a standard workflow feature for evaluations and actions, so it's something standard within the system. You can query to pull other Dynamics 365 data into it as well. And then sometimes people will even use dialogue to populate some information to another entity if needed. So the pieces of it are just your the arguments, the variables, and the step. But really, the main thing that you need to know about dialogues is what it is, and what you may use it for. That's going to be what's important when it comes to the exam, not going into the individual functionalities of that. So our next one is the custom actions, and the custom actions basically are multi-step declarative custom logic that can be invoked using API web service calls, and it allows specification of input and output variables. So in other words, if I'm creating basically code with pulling specific records and grabbing things, I can actually then utilize that with the custom action, inside the custom action, to basically bring in and ask specific values, and then those values can get put into the code as part of the variable to make them more flexible and dynamic, because when you write plugins, it's all hard-coded. You have no way of putting variables into the plugins, and this is really a way of pretty much being able to do those plugins, but adding the ability to make them dynamic. So something that works nicely. They run on demand when called from code or process, and they're always going to be synchronous as well. So this is just a good little slide on, when do you choose to use each of these? I like this slide for exam purpose because, again, it kind of puts it into a scenario base. Exam questions will always be a scenario. So it's good to see, when to use, when would you use each of these different process types. So, think of this being put into, a scenario question. So a business process flow, here it says a case resolution process. So, you have a user who is working through their case management. You need to put together a process that's going to help guide them through closing out the case to get the full resolution. Of course, I'm making this up as I'm talking, so it's not the best example, but it kind of shows you some of, it gives you a way of thinking, of how that's going to run through some of those scenarios. Working through a sales process, having an insurance quoting process, a training tool for new reps to help guide them through the process that they need to use while they're going through a training process. And again, so it's basically anywhere you want to guide people to an outcome is basically what that business process flow is. Little examples of your workflows, it's going to be, trigger automatic communications, creating tasks for people to follow up. It's going to be things like updating data, executing specific functionality. So a lot of those pieces were actually off of some of those examples I've given that I've used workflows for. You have your dialogues, which are going to be things like agent scripts when they're on the phone with somebody, being able to capture missing data and fill it in inside of the dialogue, and then when they fill it in inside the dialogue, it's going to go ahead and populate it inside the record. Billing errors or maybe adjustments. And then of course your custom actions are going to be that custom, something like being able to do a custom approval message that if certain values happen, then it's going to go ahead and trigger this custom approval message that's been populated through some of the code by pulling in some other areas as well. So now we're going to dive into talking a little bit more about the workflows. Workflows are something that you'll see a good amount of scenarios on as well. So just a few things about the basics of working with workflows. Every single workflow, it must be associated with a primary entity. The primary entity is always going to be the entity that it gets triggered on. So an example of that is when I was talking about I have a workflow that gets triggered when an opportunity gets closed. Since it's being triggered when an opportunity is closed, it needs to begin at the opportunity entity. So that's going to be the primary entity that it's going to be set at, wherever it's going to be triggered. Even if it's an on-demand workflow, which entity do you go to trigger that on-demand workflow? And once set, and you hit that save button, it's locked. It can't be changed. You'd have to rebuild your workflow to do so. Background workflows can be triggered automatically as well. They also have the ability to automatically, like when something occurs on a record or a field, it can trigger that automatically. Then you also have the on-demand option as well, and your on-demand option is going to be going into your workflow button and clicking start an on-demand workflow, and then choosing the workflow you want to run. So it's basically a manual trigger is what the on-demand is. And then Also, you can actually trigger them by other workflows. You can actually tick a box that says, you know, that it could be used as a child workflow, and you can nest a workflow inside of another workflow. So if I have a workflow and it meets a certain requirement, it can then trigger, call another workflow to start running. So you can actually nest some of those workflows. Each workflow was an owner. When the workflow runs, it will be run as this user. I think that should be each workflow has an owner. I think that's a typo. So every single workflow will have an owner, and when the workflow, this is only on background workflows, that it will always run as that owner within the system. So the next piece is talking a little bit about the scope of a workflow. It's going to be important to know about what the scope of a workflow is. So this is an important piece to know. About the workflow scope, what is it? The scope of a workflow record will be available to be executed on 4 different levels. So when I'm building my workflow and I go to my scope, these are the 4 levels that I can choose from. So by default, it's always going to be at that user level for the scope. And if it's set to the user level, it will run only on records that are owned by the same user as the workflow owner. So a good example of this is I had a client actually yesterday call, and she's like, these workflows are not running, they're not running, I can't get them to work. Well, the workflow was set to a user level, and she was trying to run a workflow on a item that she was not the owner of. And what that did was it just wouldn't trigger the workflow. It wouldn't go because her scope was off, so it wasn't working. The next level would be then to set it to a business unit level. And by setting it to the business unit level, this will run on records owned by the user in the same unit as the workflow owner as well. So within this one, it will be, if I am the owner and I'm in business unit A, it runs on the records that are owned by users, any users that are in A. So if somebody from business unit B tries to trigger this workflow, it's not going to work because I am A, they are B. It is not going to work. The next one is going to be the child business, the parent-child business unit. So very similar. We talked about security on our last call. So as you can see, these are actually your same level that your security roles are. The next one's the parent business unit. It's going to run on any record that's owned by users in the same or subordinate business unit as the workflow owner. So again, if I'm A, and then somebody, underneath business unit A, we have XYZ, but then somebody from B tries to run the workflow, it's not going to work. But if somebody from A, X, Y, or Z tries to run it, at that point in time, it's going to work for them. So the next one's going to be organization, and this means it runs on any record owned by anyone within the organization. So the majority of the time, depending on if unless there's tight security, or we need workflows to only run for a specific business unit, the majority of the time your workflows are actually going to be set to the organization. So pretty much all the individuals will be able to run it. While testing out workflows, the user level is a good one to do. So if I'm the owner, I'm a system admin, pretty much I'm the only person that's going to be able to trigger that workflow for the time being. So that's something that can definitely help while testing out the system. But just make sure that you're familiar with these scopes. So this is going to be a scenario I would think that would be a good example on the workflow scope is if you have a user that's having an issue that the workflow isn't working for them, you've checked, the workflow is activated, you've gone ahead and checked and you ran the workflow and it worked for you, but it's not working for another user, what may the possible case be? It may be because your scope is not set correctly. And also just be sure that you're familiar with how each of these levels work within those scopes. Our next one is actually talking about the triggers of the workflow. So when we're talking about triggering the workflow, we said earlier it could be done manually. That's the on-demand process. So if I'm going to go ahead and run one on demand, that is, trying to get my little pen out. There we go. So running an on-demand process, this is if I put a checkbox next to this little box right here, that's going to allow me to do that. Running it by another dialogue or through another dialogue or for a workflow, that's as a child process. You can't call it unless this checkbox has been marked. And then, of course, what's used quite a bit is the automatically triggering it just through automation. And you have a few different areas that you can do that. So one would be when a record is created. So whenever a record is created, kick the workflow off, trigger it. When a record status changes, so the state code, if it changes from active to deactive, or unactive, it will go ahead and change that as well. When the record is assigned, so when it changes ownership, go ahead and trigger this. When fields within the record change, so I can actually go in on this area right here, I hit my little select button, and then I can pick and choose if any of these specific fields have an on change to them to go ahead and trigger the workflow as well. And there's also when the record gets deleted to go ahead and start a specific workflow. You can combine any of those automations from above as well. It gives you the opportunity to do that. So the next piece is talking about the conditions. So you went through and you said, okay, when is this workflow going to trigger? We talked about, who can trigger it, when will it get triggered. Now you have to start thinking about some of the conditions and actions that it can take. This is going to be important to understand the difference as well between conditions and actions, and you also may want to just be aware of what conditions and what actions you can do, and what each of those can perform. Might be something you want to review as well. So your conditions are basically, I can either do a check condition, which is going to say I want to check a specific value to see if it meets a certain criteria. So that's pretty much used any time that you actually trigger on a status change, or anytime you do it when a field, or when a field within a records gets changed. You normally always have a check condition saying, I want to check that the status was 1. And then if that condition is met, you go into your action. You can because as well with when a field within a record gets changed, it's important to say, okay, great, it got changed, but does it qualify, for what I need it, the value to be? Does it qualify for that for me to now perform a specific action? Just because the address is populated doesn't necessarily mean I need this workflow to trigger. But if the address is populated and it's in the state of Georgia, well, then I needed to go ahead and send out an email to the Georgia representatives to do XYZ. So that's what that check condition is going to be. The wait condition is the one that I had talked about just a few moments earlier. The wait condition is basically going ahead and, saying, pretty much go to sleep, which is a time out until a specified date and time. The other one will be the other option. You have timeout or when a value basically gets changed. And of course, once it gets changed, then you have to put a condition to say, is it the value you were waiting for? If not, go back to sleep. If not, go ahead and continue on. So you do have the ability to do the wait, those wait conditions. But as far as the actions go, what can your workflow do for you? What is it going to do? Is it going to create a new record like the example I gave on my opportunity? If it gets closed as one, it automatically creates a job record. That would be the create record option. The other one is update the record. I can actually say that if an opportunity goes over a specific dollar amount, then I need to update another field within the record. That could be one option. But of course you could use business rules to accomplish something that simple. But an example of this one that I actually utilize the update record is our client on one of ours has proposals, and anytime that they update a proposal and they update the dollar amount on the proposal, it's not quotes, it's actually something a little different, has a total different functionality. But whenever they have these proposals and they update the dollar amount on the proposal, it needs to go into the related opportunity and update the estimated revenue on the opportunity. So that's an example of the update. So if the proposal, it checks a condition. If the dollar amount on the proposal gets changed, then it goes into the related opportunity and updates a value on that. That's an example of your update record. Another thing is just assigning records, very common. So you can actually say that if something happens, to assign the record. This is actually common that as an opportunity goes through different stages, that it may change ownership. So you can automate it that say once it goes into a certain stage, change the owner to the record to X or Y. That can be done. We can send off emails. So if something happens and it gets triggered, I can send an email. My example on that one was again with the opportunity. As soon as that closed, it would create the job and then send an email to those individuals that they needed to go in and populate the job information. We have the ability and action to start a child workflow from within as well. You also can go in and perform an action. There's just a few actions that are pre-populated by Dynamics 365 in there. And then you also have changing the status. So if something happens, let's go ahead and close this opportunity. But the example that I can also use on this one as well is with those proposals, we have it that if a new proposal to the opportunity gets created, it actually goes into the old proposal and automatically changes that status to deactivated. So it only keeps one active proposal open at all times. So this is an example of, combining some of these actions together. We're using the update record, we're using the change status record, and a few different actions within that one workflow. Another one is to stop the workflow, and your stop workflow is going to go ahead and actually stop the workflow from continuing on. So say if you get to a certain condition, you can actually say stop workflow, and it just forces it to stop to make sure nothing else occurs at that point in time. You also have the ability to add dynamic values into your system. Dynamic values are fantastic. It just allows you to go in and actually, take values off of a record and populate it onto something. So in other words, if I'm building an email, I can use dynamic values to get the person's first name and last name off the user record. I can actually utilize that to say, what the opportunity name is and put that opportunity name inside of the email. So some of the options that you have on this are just, set to, so I can set it to a specific value. I can append with, so if I have one value, I can append another value onto it. I can actually clear the value. That is something that gets used quite often because people sometimes don't have the ability to clear out options very easily. You also can do increment by, so I can go, if it's a numeric value, I can have it increment by 1 each time, so it basically counts up. A lot of us used to use that as a feature before we had some of those calculated fields or roll-up fields. And then you also have the way to decrement as well, and then also multiply. So you can do some basic formulas within those workflows by using those dynamic value area. And of course, very important is all workflows need to be activated. So workflows need to be activated before they can be used. Activation will prevent it from being edited. So once it gets activated, it is locked and nobody can make changes to it. They will have to deactivate it before they can modify it and go back into it. So that's going to be the what's going to have to happen within that area. Now we're going to go ahead and go away from the slide decks for a little bit, which I know you're probably all excited about, because we're going to come into the CRM system, or excuse me, the Dynamics 365 system, and we're going to take a look at all of the different processes and just the different areas within those processes. So right now you should be seeing my screen, and I'm sitting in the process area, and you can get to this by going into settings and going into processes. That's the quickest way to get there. There's also a way to get there by going through the customization page. At the very bottom, they actually have a process area where you can go into it as well. So first thing is you do have these different, let me open actually all processes. You have the ability to see the different categories. So here you can see I have business process flows. That's one type. I even have, workflows. We have some actions here as well. The only thing that I don't actually already have is a dialogue. That's the one thing I don't have within, that's already showing within my process area. You can see on the right hand side that basically all of my workflows are currently, or excuse me, my processes are currently activated as well. So all of those are activated. You can basically select multiple items. Here we go. And then you can also deactivate them at the time. As soon as you deactivate them, they'll be available for you to start editing. But let's jump in and take a look at just working with the workflows real quick. So right here, we're going to go ahead and create a workflow off the opportunity when closed. So I'm going to do a quick little workflow that basically is going to notify some users when the item is closed. So the first thing is I get to pick which process type I'm going to use. There's my 4 different types, and in this case we're going to just choose a workflow. Remember, we had talked about you have to have that primary trigger or entity of where it's going to be triggered. In this case, it's going to be when that opportunity gets closed. So my primary entity is going to be opportunity. So I choose opportunity from the list. Right at this point, we can choose if this is going to run in the background, which again is still the recommended process. But if we wanted to do it as a real-time workflow, we could always deselect that or unselect that, and it's going to run as a real-time workflow. It does allow you to change it after the fact, so that is something that you could do. There's nothing in scenarios about templates, so we're not going to worry about templates at this time. And once I go ahead and hit my next button, it pops up and lets you start building and working on your workflow. I'm going to come here to my administration tab. This area basically tells you who the owner of the workflow is. So depending on who the the owner of the workflow is going to depend on the scope that we had talked about. But we'll look at each of these areas first. The first thing is the process name. Of course, I can change that after the fact if I need to. It's activated as a process. It's a process in the system. But you'll notice the entity is now locked down, as well as the type of process is locked down as well. I can't change that after the fact. When would we actually run this workflow? Currently right now it's running as a background. We can do a check to say that we want to be able to run it on demand, but in this case we're just notifying when it gets closed, so not anything I want my users to be able to manually force to trigger. The other one is to run it as a child process. That's going to be if we're nesting it. In this case we are not. And again, what's important to notice is the scope. So currently, if it's set to user, I am the only person that will be able to trigger the workflow, and it's going to be if I own it. If I want everyone within the organization to have this work for them, I go ahead and change it to organization. So the scope method is something I'll need to change. So when do I want this workflow to get triggered? So if I'm going to notify when it gets closed, what is my trigger? Does anybody want to throw that in the chat box? What's my trigger going to be? So I want to send out a notification when my opportunity gets closed. Awesome, Deb. Welcome back, Deb. Hope you got some good sleep. And then we also have, status change. Perfect. So what we're going to do is come in here and we're going to go into our record status changes. Now, we do have the other options. I'll just show them real quick, just in case that would have been the case. When I choose my record status change, just to let you know, it does actually select it on my fields here as well. It does auto select it for me, but it's just nice because it doesn't force you to go in and have to do that. So if I come in to my selected field, I could actually also come in, and choose what's going to be the trigger. So you notice status is automatically already selected for me since that's the one I'm going to be doing. But I could choose other fields if I wanted to as well. So that's basically on change, trigger this workflow on those specific items. So currently right now we're just going to do it on the record status change. So the next thing I'm going to need to do is build a condition. And that is basically, I need to check that it goes into a closed status, because I don't care if it goes into a 1 status. I want to go ahead and do it as a closed status. And we're going to go a little bit deeper as well. And here I said I just want to notify when it's closed, but we're going to say, let's actually change that to 1. We only care about when, notify when 1. So what I have to do here is I go into the condition, I click on my hyperlink, and from here it's going to allow me to pull this up and start building the condition. So what entity am I looking at? I'm looking at the opportunity entity. What field am I looking at? I'm looking at my status field, and basically I'm looking for a specific value. So if my opportunity status equals, and then from here I can choose 1. At that point in time, I can then tell it to go into the action. So those are my condition. Then my action, I have all those other available items. So let me move that down a little so you can see them all. So there's my create record. I could have it create a new record. I can go ahead and have it update a record, assign a record, send out that email, start a child workflow as well, perform an action, change the status, and stop the workflow. So in this case, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to create an item. I'm kind of mimicking the example that I had told you all a little bit earlier. So from there, we're actually going to just say agreement. We're going to have it create an agreement when it gets closed. So every time we close an opportunity, it needs to create an agreement in there. Just to let you know, these little pieces up here, just for anybody that hasn't worked with workflows in the past, this is just for you to be able to put notes about what's happening. So if somebody comes behind you, they know what's happening within these areas of the workflow. I need to set the property and then basically build out what I want to do. So from here I can say I want the service account of the agreement to be the account that was on the opportunity. So over here it's already on the opportunity entity, and it's only going to pick the same type of field, so it's going to be the account field. So now it's going to automatically fill that out. As far as the billing account goes, I want that to be the same. And then of course we have a system status that has to get populated. So we're going to actually put this into an estimate value so people can kind of work on it. The start date, you can even do things to make it go a little bit further into the future. So from here I can say that we after the opportunity closes, it's not going to start until 24 hours to give us time to get our processing done. So from that I can actually come into saying, you know, 1 day after the opportunity has an actual close date. So once the opportunity closes and has the actual close date, make this agreement have a start date of 1 day after. So it lets me build out some of these items. And then the end date, it's always going to be basically 1 year after that. So now I can say we're going to go ahead and set this for 12 months after the close date. So it's going to begin after and then do 12 months after the close date. Technically, I'd go in and do 12 days in 1 day, 12 months in 1 day, but this is only our example. It needs a duration. We'll go ahead and just you know, put something in there. But as you can see, you can kind of build this dynamically, which is nice. So I can come in and just start kind of populating some of those items. Then I just save and close, and it's going to go ahead and do that for me. The other item is going to go in, I can add an email. So from here I can create a new message and then send off that message as well. So from here I have my from, I can have it a static person. So maybe, you know, the mod administrator is, you know, my standard email address that we do all of our outgoing mail from. Who's this going to be sent to? We want it to go to the owner of the opportunity. So it's going to send to them. You can even go further and say you want it to go to maybe the manager of the opportunity. So even a step further.
Is it works?
Out.
But I will share a record with you.
Yeah, you are sharing the record.
With you.
All right, so from here I can even go a step further and say, all right, let's go into the entity of the owner, and then from go into the manager and add it. So now this is going to go to the manager of the person that owns the opportunity, and you know,
Is it works?
close, and go in and fill that item out. So then you can save and close. So that's an example of, you know, being able to use some of the dynamic pieces of it and building that. And then very important, this is not going to work until we hit that activate button. And once I hit this activate button, now it's going to be able to run whenever we close out an opportunity within the system. So from here, I now can go into an opportunity. So I go into my sales, I go into opportunities, and from here I'm going to take one of my open opportunities,
Correct me if I'm wrong.
and we're going to go ahead and close it. So from here we're going to close this as one.
In case of share,
And now, basically, as soon as this record changes, it's going to go ahead and trigger that to go ahead and kick off. So it's going to kick off at that point. So from here, I can come in, I can look at my oh, we don't have our little guy back here, but you can go in, you can see the workflows that automatically get created as well. So I'm just hitting the refresh button to see if we can see any posts or activities that have happened on the back side. So from here, let's see if we can see that email that has gone out. By default, the regarding normally defaults. I didn't double check it, but normally it defaults to the item. So from here, activities, actually don't see that yet. Whoop. Some new little thing that's happening within the dynamics piece. So what I'm going to do here is go into my advanced find real quick and look under agreements, see if it created our new agreement as well. So from here, we're going to go into agreements. And for some reason, it did not trigger. So we would need to go in and figure out what that piece is. So what we will do is I'm going to go through because I want to stay on schedule. I'll finish out those other ones. If we have time, we'll take a look and see what may have been the purpose of that little guy not triggering. So our next piece is going in, and we're going to take a look at it also might be the piece that it hasn't actually finished going through the system. We're going to go ahead and finish through our presentation, and when we go back in the system, we will take a look at the end of our business process flows. So again, that is working through those workflows. Some of the important things you want to remember when it comes to some scenarios you may be faced with are scope and actions that it can do. Also your background, which is asynchronous, and your real-time, which is synchronous, as well as, what are dialogues, how do they work. Those are going to be important pieces when it comes to your workflows. The next part is talking a little bit about your business process flows. As I said, they've had an overhaul on the appearance of how they actually are configured in the system, but the actual architecture of them is really the same. So that piece has not changed. So we'll just talk about the business process flows. We'll talk about the stages, the steps, and the categories. We'll also talk a little bit about the different options, some of the conditional branching you can put in. And one thing that is new to the business process flows is you can actually now trigger workflows off of the business process flow as well. So basically, when it changes a stage, we're not talking about triggered off of a value within the process flow. We're talking about the awesomeness that if it changes from one stage to another, it actually will allow you to have a workflow triggered. And you also have the ability to do role-driven process flows as well, which is something that they have in the past. So with this being said, the first thing is, what are they? Again, it's really a way to guide users through specific processes within your system. Stages and steps match how the user thinks about what they're trying to do. So as you're trying to guide them through a process, those stages are basically, in this example, I need to qualify something. Then once I qualify it, I need to develop it. Once I develop it, I need to go through some proposals. After I propose it, I need to go through the closure. So that's going to be the pieces that you need to kind of think about what a business process flow is trying to accomplish. So those are the stages. And then your steps are the tasks inside of the stage that you need to complete to move on to the next one. Enabling your business process flows, basically, They're enabled from the entity definition screen. You can enable them from the process area as well. Each process flow is associated with a primary entity. So where does it, where do you see that process bar begin? But it can span across multiple entities. Changes are evaluated within real time. This is going to give instant feedback on the data that's provided. So in other words, if you have conditions in there, those conditions are going to pop up at real time for you. It ships with several out-of-the-box process flows that are enabled by default, which is nice. You can go ahead and deactivate some of them as well. So they don't necessarily have to be activated. You also do have to go into the entity and click activate in order to get it to start working as well. So this is just a screenshot of the new process flow editor. So as you see, it does, as you see, it does look a little bit different here. And then you have on your right-hand side, it just has these component areas. These 4 items are within your component areas, which we'll talk about. So from here, within the component area, this is where you basically have your stage, which is what we had in the past. You had your stage, and then you also have the ability to put in a condition in between your stages. So when you have a condition, so the flow is just going to work a little bit differently when you're designing it, but again, thinking through the process of it, it will still be the same. Underneath your composition area are basically building out the steps, putting in all of the fields that they're going to have to work through to complete a stage. And then you also have the ability to put in workflows. I would put a little star on this page that you do need to be familiar with the word flow and what's under flow, composition, and what's under composition, and just knowing what these definitions are. So this is a page I would be putting a star on if I was thinking about doing any type of multiple choice things in the future. Basically, using your stage and steps and categories, this is the same as it was in the previous version. It just has a different look to it. You can only have one entity per stage, so right here we're looking at a lead. You can customize each step label or make them required of the flow just like before. You could like rename a field name and give it a new label on your process bar. And then you can do the same thing of making it required, so that is the same. Your stage category can be defined for reporting as well. That is the same as well. It was the drop down in the old method. And then each business process flow can contain 30 stages and 30 steps per stage as well. So just something to keep in mind, that there are some limitations on how big and grand your business flow can be. Again, what's important to know is you can span across multiple entities, and it is important to know that you cannot do more than 5 entities. So 5 entity is going to be your max when you're spanning across entities. Relationships do not need to exist between entities, so if I go from a lead to an opportunity in the out-of-the-box one, there's a relationship from the lead to the entity. But I do also have the ability to have a brand new entity that's going to be the next step of a process flow as well. Only entities that have business process flow enabled on the entity definition can be part of the flow. So I had mentioned you do have to activate this within the entity. You have to turn it on in order for this to be able to work. You can only leverage one-to-many entity relationships. So if I'm working on a flow and there is a relationship in between them, it can only be the one-to-many relationship. You also still have the ability to do conditional branching. So this is really very similar to what we were talking about on the workflows. It's an if condition. So, you know, if it meets a certain criteria, then do something. But the big difference between this one is your if condition would just basically bring you to a different step, or excuse me, a different stage. So it basically just allows you to build in, you know, dynamic process flows. So instead of going to, after I finish developing, that if I go ahead and find out that it's a new car instead of a used car, my next stage may be different. It may not go directly to propose. If they say used, it has to go through a trade-in value, you know, process first before it goes to that next stage. So just a few little, you know, things about it is, you know, while using them, you can only go branches can only go 5 deep when using branches. You can change the next stage or future stage depending on input from the current stage that you're on. You cannot mix and or statements. So if I'm doing, you know, I can't say, you know, if an opportunity is marked as 1 and it is marked as and the value is over X amount, or it was closed within a certain date. I can't mix those. It has to be, all of them have to be ands, or all of them have to be ors. And your results are going to be in real time when using the conditions. New feature, executing workflows. This is a new feature. You have 2 options. The first one is stage specific, which executes a workflow upon entering or exiting a stage. Great. So instead of having to build a manual workflow and making a condition that says if these 2 values are marked at a certain thing, and actually having to kind of build it to make sure it works, or read a different field to kick off the workflow, you can do it direct. You can call it directly now from within your business process flow. The other one is a global, which executes a workflow upon the process being applied, reactivated, abandoned, completed. So some different pieces there. Your workflows must be configured as on-demand workflows. So you do have to go and build the workflow. You make it an on-demand workflow, and this just gives you the ability to call those workflows from the stage specific or the global area. Workflows can be used to launch business process flows as well, which is great. The next thing is just talking about security on it. You do have the ability to put security on a business process flow, which will actually go ahead and close out that security for you. So at that point in time, you'll actually be able to say only people with a security role salesperson will see this process, business process flow. But other individuals with sales manager would actually see this process flow. So you actually have the ability to apply that on there just to see which one you're actually going to be using. So that's going to be the case that it's going to be used. All right, so from there, I'm going to now come in and show you a quick demo on that, just so you guys can see what that looks like in the new Dynamics 365 app. So it looks a little bit different. As well as my business process flow did not kick off because of my, my workflow did fail, and that was because I grabbed agreements and it just didn't like some of the information that I had filled out within it, so it failed while it was trying to create the agreement. So right there, see, sales tax code is required. I missed a required field. So within that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back into our processes. I'm going to pull open a business process flow that is in the system so you can just see the layout of it. What I'm going to do is the first one I'm going to do is just pull up the standard lead to opportunity. because it's just a very simple workflow. So this is the new designer. Remember, you need to know these components. You have the flow, you have the composition, and what is in each of those. So here's an example of what the new designer looks like. It's the same, except it's just more of like a Visio format than how it was before, when it was just, from top to bottom you would have to do you would have to kind of create that. I can expand this and I can see the different steps that are in the stage. So my stage here, if I click on it, I can see that we are calling this the qualify stage. And then I can apply it to the qualify category. It begins within the lead entity. If I click on my steps, I can see that it's pulling in those steps or those fields. So I'm using the existing contact field. This is the display name I'm giving it. And you can even change the order of your sequence as well. So before you used to kind of use a arrow up and down to move them around. Now you use the sequence in order to get that to work appropriately. You also have the ability to go in and apply some of the workflows as well. So that is the ability to kind of pull in and apply a workflow. So you can utilize the workflow piece as well. Actually, I'll do it from here and then add a workflow. And then I can come through and build my workflow from this area as well. So it allows you to do some of those pieces. So this is an existing one. The one I also wanted to show you was the knowledge base, just the point that it shows you some if conditions as well. So from here you can see I have some conditions that are built in. So if I take a look, I'll zoom out a little just so we can see a little bit more on the screen. Or there we go. You can see it starts with, the author. They go through certain steps. Our next stage is the reviewer, and then they put in a condition. And the condition is if the review equals rejected, then we can see that there's a little X down here, and it skips over the update content, and it goes to the publish phase. So it actually skips it and goes around it. And then if it meets the condition, it went straight into the knowledge article. So it will go through. So you can build in some of those conditions within the system. So it allows you to do that. It has little things like your snapshot. It also has things for you to be able to, quickly kind of see what your flow and layout is on this small miniature map as well. But altogether, it's very intuitive. It's more of a GUI interface where people can, go ahead and drop and drag things in. So I can say, after publish, we're going to go to this next stage, and then I can start building it out as well. So it actually gives me the ability to just very easily, by dragging and dropping, putting it into those areas as well of where I want them to go. So definitely something that works nicely within the system. So again, just be familiar with these component areas. Just be familiar that, what your stages are. That's your broad piece. Your steps are within them. You have the ability to do conditions, as well as you have a way of actually triggering off on-demand workflows now from within these areas. Those are going to be the important things that you need to know, as well as you do have to activate them in order for them to work within the system as well. So they do have to be activated. All right, so with that being said, that brings us to the end of the that part of the session. So we'll go through our polls real quick. Before we do so, does anybody have any questions on anything that we had covered today? It was a pretty quiet class today. So we will go ahead and do our polls real quick, and just I always like to just show what our next steps are going to be. So our next steps are going to be solution. So next week we'll be working on solution, and entity and field customization basics will be our next course. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our poll questions here. Our first one, all you need to do is look at the question and click on your screen what you believe the answer is. And normally I give you all just a few moments to go through, and then I'll start counting down, and then when I get to 0, I close out the polls. So all you do is click on the screen and you can answer the question. You have a user that cannot edit any records in the account. Prakash, just click on the screen. You don't need to put the answer on the Prakash and Jose. Veronica, just click on the screen. Just click on your screen. You don't have to type anything in. All right? Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, perfect. So with that being said, you should all see the results now. You guys were 79% correct. The answer is if you have a user that cannot edit any records in the account entity, what's the most likely way to fix the issue? Grant a higher access level on the right permissions on the account entity. That is correct. Now the thing is, what's interesting about this is very CRM answer, and the reason I'm saying that is you have a user that cannot edit any records, which means they can read them, they can't edit it, so they already have a security role. So you have to kind of think like that. So they'll throw things in your questions like that to kind of throw you off. You would think, oh, they don't have a security role, but the question says they can't edit any records, which means they could already read them. So they do have a security role. So kind of think like that while you're going through and answering some of these questions. The next one, you have a user with a security role with read permissions on account and without read permission on cases. You place them onto a team that only has read permissions on cases. What then happens to the user? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, good job everybody, 75% of you. Users will now see accounts and contacts. So remember, when you have two security rules that are applied to you, whether it's directly on your user account or on a team account, they layer on top of each other. So what's going to happen is they place on top of each other, and if they were able to, read accounts and now they can read cases, they're going to have the ability to read both of them. Okay? So our next one, number 3. You have a user that you need to turn off the ability to synchronize appointments, contacts, and tasks. Where in the system would you configure this?
Time but 10 minutes.
All right.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we were pretty much all over on this one, but 34% of you were correct with user mailbox. Within the user mailbox, you have the ability under the synchronization area to say how you're going to synchronize the area, to synchronize those items. If you're not going to synchronize them, then you go ahead and set that to none. So that's the mailbox place that I was telling you that you'll just need to take a look at within the system. So that's going to be that area. Your next one is, yes, so the answer was B, user mailbox B. All right, so our next item, so again, if you know the answer, just click on the screen, please. It'll take in your answer that way. Number 4 is going to be All of your account records can only be edited by the account owner. So all account records can only be edited by the account owner. You need to be able to dynamically add users to be able to edit different records without changing the ownership. How do you accomplish this? Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so on this one, the answer, 62 of you are correct. It's going to be utilizing access teams. So a few keywords in here. Dynamically add users to give them permissions is going to be access teams. It's not going to be an owner team because you don't want to change ownership. The answer is B. So it's going to be that you don't want to go ahead and change the ownership. So 62 of you did get that. You don't want to grant higher permissions on a specific security role because it's only some specific accounts on different records that you're interested in doing that on. All right, the next one is number 5. Which of the following does auditing not allow you to do? So basically 3 of these allow you to do things. 1 of them auditing does not do for you. And I think somebody actually asked the question on the class, so that's kind of ironic. So somebody had actually asked the question of the item that it doesn't do. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good job, everybody. 64% of you were right with C. C is the answer. A, B, and D all are available in auditing. You can't run a report on audit changes, though. That one is not available within the system. All right, so our next one is looking at number 6. All right, you need to generate a process to create a task when an opportunity is closed as one. What type of process should you use?
Real time.
That should be very obvious since I did it on my demo. All right, ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and close the polls. All right, so the answer is B. It's background workflows. 59% of you are correct in that. So we did a background workflow, which then allowed me to go ahead and create that task. So our next one, number 7. That last one was the last one was B. Number 7, you all will get the answers to this as well. So just know that you'll get the answer key as soon as we finish. You will need to generate a process that will prompt users a question and capture their response. Which
B.
do you use to do this?
B.
All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
C or D?
Perfect. All right, so the answer is D. The answer is D. It's going to be dialogue. Very good. All right, number 8, almost there. 2 more to go. After this, you need to generate a workflow that will only run on records that are owned by a user that is the same as the workflow owner. Which do you use?
User.
Perfect. Good job, everybody. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. A is the answer, and that is user. So if it's going to be the same, the person that owns it, and it's the person the workflow owner and the person that owns the record, user is the answer on that one. All right, number 9. Which of the following is not a business process flow component? There were 4 items that were possible components. 2 flows, and I forgot off the top of my head what they call that other section. Composites, I think. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to close it. And the answer on that one is action. That is not part of a business process flow. You can create a stage, you can create a step, you can create a workflow or trigger off a workflow, but not an action. So the answer on that is C. All right, last one, and Janina is going to be posting the answers for you all so you can have a key to this. You are creating a business process flow across leads, opportunities, quotes, orders, projects, and invoices. You cannot complete your business process flow. What's the most likely cause? Now this again is very Microsoft exam-like because there's some distractors in there that you're saying, well, it could be this and it could be that, but one of them is the most obvious answer, and that's pretty much how the exams work. So this is a pretty good example of that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the answer on this one is you have reached the maximum amount of entities per business process flow, so C. That is going to be the most likely cause because, as you can see, there's leads, opportunities, quotes, orders, projects, and invoices. So you're trying to create 6 items of entities, and you're only allowed to do 5. So the maximum was 5 between that. All right, so thank you, Janina. She has uploaded the answer key in the content area under the attachment, so please feel free to download that. I want my certification. That's awesome. All right, so remember, these aren't the real questions. These are just example questions, you know, just to kind of make the interaction fun and to make it go a little bit, you know, closer to what that is. So yes, I wish I could hand you all certifications. That would be fantastic. So with that being said, thank you everybody. We'll see you back next week as well. So good luck over the weekend and play with the system, and we'll come back and we'll work on some solutions. So thank you everybody. Sorry we went about 10 minutes over. The polls, I always forget how much time they take. So we'll take that into consideration for next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the audio portion of the session. We are looking forward to welcome you again next Monday. Have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.
Sorry.